Thanks, Morgan. So, who Sustainability West Midlands are? We're not based in Somerset. You won't be surprised to know that, I'm sure. But our adaptation work does cover the whole of the country. In fact, actually, the NHS work that we've been doing on climate change adaptation, which Morgan's just put on the screen there, we'll put some links in the chat as well to those resources as well. Is England wide. It's certainly not exclusive to the West Midlands. Our gravity is in the West Midlands, so we advise businesses, local authorities, NHS trusts, numerous organisations in the region on broad sustainability action and activity. We've been in operation for 22 years, 23 years now, actually. We're in 2025, aren't we? So it ticked over another year. And we're a not-for-profit organisation, and basically our role is to help organisations share good practice, chat to each other about sustainability, get action happening on the ground, and all that sort of thing. But particularly on the adaptation work, we're quite a unique organisation, so there aren't many of us out there. We've increasingly been invited to do lots of work across the country on this topic, and adaptation is increasingly one of the biggest areas we work on, because there's frankly not a lot of other organisations doing this. And equally, a lot of, particularly NHS trusts as well, have got perhaps their net zero action plan in order, and they know what they're doing on that. Obviously, implementation is harder, but at least they've got their plan. Whereas adaptation is often the thing that's been left behind and that needs further support. So that's why we're doing a lot of work in this kind of area at the moment. Yeah, so that's all I'll say on us. You can find out more on our website, of course, and we'll put that link in there as well. So today, I'm going to be handing over to my colleague Morgan shortly, who's going to provide an introduction to this topic, and who will be, telling you all you need to know about adaptation. She's done work with the NHS on adaptation for the last 18 months to 2 years, knows the NHS inside out, like an encyclopedia of NHS knowledge, which is no mean feat, I can assure you, as I'm sure you guys all know. We've got a discussion about your current experiences of dealing with extreme weather as like a bit of an icebreaker conversation. And then the activity later on, when we talk about what adaptation actually is, will be to get you thinking about your exposure and vulnerability to climate risks, and actually getting to think about what those look like and what you can do about those. We'll have a brief break just after 11, as I mentioned. Then we'll be talking about the drivers for adaptation. So it's kind of the so what question. It's all very well saying, well, climate change is happening, but actually, what are the drivers are that there for you guys to hook to?
You want to go around the side there? Yeah. I'll meet you there.
Can we just mute the person who's on the background noise, please? Thank you. And that sounded very surreal from this end. It was, anyway. Yes, and then we've got our final activity, which is looking at actual adaptation. What can we do about this, essentially, and embedding adaptation across the work you're doing? And then we'll obviously conclude at the end, and we'll let you go for 12 o'clock. But before I hand over to Morgan, I'm just going to hand over to Christine Young, who we've been working with on this agenda today, on this workshop today, just for some opening remarks. Christine, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your time today. Your expertise in your individual roles is really welcome in this conversation, so it's really great to have you along. I recognise we're all time poor as well, so it's difficult to free up time, but I'm glad you're here, so thank you very much for all joining. So as Alan said, climate change is a difficult topic. Climate resilience and adaptation is complex and multifaceted, and it can be quite difficult to think about how we tackle it, and how our roles sort of feed into it, really. So Sustainability West Midlands kindly agreed to facilitate this session today, to help introduce some of the colleagues that perhaps this topic is new to, and to reintroduce some of the colleagues that supported on the Greener Digital project last year. So I'm hoping this session will be helpful to all, really. I just made some notes just to make sure I don't forget anything. So really today, it's about a reintroduction, an introduction to the topic, but to think really about how your roles can feed in, or how they feed in to climate resilience, but it is difficult to sort of conceptualize that sometimes. So yeah, hopefully this session will provide some helpful context, really. We are trying to look at shaping our digital chapter of our digital resilience and climate adaptation plan, and I'm really hoping that this session will help colleagues think about that and how they can sort of help inform and shape that too, as a sort of outcome going forward. But please do feel free, as Alan said, to ask questions in the chat. If there's anything that you're not sure about, please do ask. Engage as much as you can. We're really hoping that you'll get as much out of this session as possible, really. And we'll catch up as we go through. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Christine. That's great. And yeah, just to echo that, of course, as well, thanks for your time. 2 hours doesn't seem like a long time, but we know that it is for everyone here. So we are grateful for your attendance today. Right. I'm chairing this session, but I have a completely devoid of knowledge compared to my wonderful colleague Morgan, who's going to be presenting today. Just before we move on to that, this is obviously the purpose of today. Hopefully this will summarises what we'll be doing with you today. So learning about climate change and how it affects the health and healthcare sector, what functions the ICS may have in terms of how it could be affected by climate change, and what actually can we do about this, as I mentioned before, as part of the agenda. And to start thinking about this now, it's over to you, Morgan.
Thank you both, and thanks everybody for being here. Lovely to see you. I'll just dive straight in since everybody's done the lovely introductions for me already. So we're going to talk just a little bit about some key definitions to make sure we're all on the same page with kind of what we're talking about, like Al said. So when we're talking about climate change in general, here's some context around that. We've got the greenhouse gases that, like carbon dioxide, that we know trap heat in our atmosphere. And we also know that human activities like burning fossil fuels, other things like agriculture as well, have led to a surplus of these gases, and therefore an observed increase in global temperatures. And that this is related to an accelerated climate change. So we know all of this to be true. When we actually say climate change, though, what that means, certainly with respect to England, is expecting things like increased temperatures in both summer and winter, but also increasing temperatures impacting other things like rainfall, for example. So we're having overall drier summers projected and wetter winters, so more rain in the winter. As well as that, though, more intense events as well, so severe weather incidents, and then the things that come with that, like high winds, and also more intense downpour events in the winter and the summer. So even if the summers are drier overall, having those sudden downpour events as well. So that's what we mean when we say, actual climate change. Those are the hazards we're talking about. I wanted to start by bringing in net zero, because I think often with the sustainability agenda, this is what people are thinking of, words like net zero, decarbonisation, carbon footprint. Those are all talking about climate change mitigation is the terminology that we normally use, which I appreciate can be complicated when we talk about risk mitigation and EPRR, but that's why I wanted to clarify. So when we talk about climate change mitigation, it's about avoiding and reducing emission of those gases I just mentioned. So that's when net zero carbon comes from. That's where reducing our carbon emissions comes from. This is a really important part of the sustainability agenda, but that's about essentially trying to slow climate change, which is not what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be talking about adaptation, so about adapting to those changes in climate. The reason that we have to do both is shown in this graph here that I don't expect you guys to spend too much time looking at, but just to show you that blue line at the top that says current policies, even if the NHS achieves its net zero targets, even if internationally and nationally we achieve our targets with respect to emissions reductions, that green line there that goes quite sharply down, that's what we would actually have to be doing to be able to achieve the type of reducing climate change to the amount that has been agreed in the Paris Agreement. So that big gap there is the amount that we're missing out on, basically. Essentially, even if we do everything we're supposed to with net zero, we're still going to see an element of climate change. So we still have to prepare for that. The impacts, so I've shown you those examples of some hazards. Those are things like flooding, heavy rain, heat waves, high winds. But the actual impacts that we're talking about could be anything from excess heat deaths. It's projected that it might triple by 2050. I realise I actually haven't changed this slide because the Environment Agency have updated their information around exposure to flooding recently this month. So more people could be exposed to flooding. I can't remember if that statistic exactly doubling by 2050 has changed, but certainly they thought that currently 1.9 million people are exposed to flooding, and it's now, oh, I don't want to be misquoted, around maybe 4 million. Anyway, it's changed a lot, the amount of people that they realise are exposed to flooding already currently. Damaged properties and infrastructure from flooding, but also from things like high winds, high heats, those cascading failures that we might experience, which are really important to consider from a digital aspect, I think. So it's not just about the impacts that might happen directly to you or to your building or organisation or people, but also, you know, what if the transport systems are impacted? What about when the trains can't run because it is over 20 degrees or whatever it normally ends up being, or if it's particularly cold? So, you know, what about IT systems that overheat, and what about our water accessibility, things like that? Also, increased incidences of pest diseases and invasion of non-native species. So that might be with respect to an increased amount of vector-borne diseases that we don't normally see in this country, or a longer period of time that those are around. So, you know, Lyme disease being seen in the winter now because milder winters mean that the ticks survive for longer, for example. So, and also obviously the impacts that has on things like agriculture and nature as well. So, you know, the qualities of our soils and water might be impacted, but also things like those pests and diseases impacting agricultural productivity and therefore food security. The biggest thing to say here is that people with existing vulnerabilities and deprivation are likely to be the worst affected. It's really important to get that in there. You know, these are all impacts that all of us are going to feel. But yeah, just to recognise that people with existing vulnerabilities are likely to be worst affected. The other reason this is important now, in case I haven't convinced you yet, is that climate change is a thing of the present. You know, we are already experiencing a lot of these extremes that our society isn't able to cope with. You know, the 2022 heat wave, over that summer, we had record-breaking temperatures in England. We had the first ever level 4 heat health alert. We had 3,000 excess deaths, and the research showed that climate change made that heat wave 10 times more likely. So even if we've seen heat like that before, maybe the intensity of it or the length of it, things like that are going to change. You know, that we're likely to see more, or the frequency of things like storms as well. So this, there are lots of storms I could have talked about. You know, Storm Dara before Christmas impacted lots of us, I'm sure. But specifically I've chosen these ones because we had 3 storms in 1 week in 2022. You had amber warnings for winds in lots of different areas, including Somerset, and a red warning in Somerset. A red warning for wind in Somerset. 1.4 million homes lost power. Nearly 22,000 in this region, in the Somerset region alone, because of the wind and storm affecting power stations. 4 people were killed tragically in this storm as well. So, you know, these things are there's already things that we need to do to make sure we're more resilient to the impacts right now, never mind in the future. I've talked about quite a few of these, but I just wanted to slowly get slightly more specific. So health and well-being, obviously excess deaths, and acute severe incidents are a really important thing to consider. You know, things like flooding and heat waves can cause issues there and then to health, but also more general increased temperatures and prolonged sun exposure can increase health-related issues. That might be things like cardiovascular and cerebrovascular conditions, respiratory conditions, air pollution. Poor air pollution gets worse in higher temperatures, so things like that being impacted, and also even things like sleep disruption and disorders, and of course mental health. The impacts from mental health are very far-reaching when it comes to climate, not just things like climate anxiety or you know, the mental health impact it has on people that have been flooded or that might flood, but also just generally the mental health impact it has on you having to work in hotter conditions or less comfortable conditions or that sort of thing. Service delivery is the other side that's most relevant to the NHS. So it's not only about the direct health impacts that climate change has to the people that you that you treat and that you serve as a NHS. It's also about actually your assets. You know, up to 10% of UK hospitals are currently in areas of significant flood risk, and up to 90% of hospital wards could be at risk of overheating due to design. So, you know, things like the performance of your buildings, and also things like energy security, you know, with rising costs and rising insecurity of utilities, that could have an impact. And then, of course, all those things around cascading impacts that we mentioned already. Then to talk specifically about the digital side. So hopefully you can see already kind of how this might relate to digital, but just as an example of this, Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital in London, I believe they're based in London, the disruption they had in Heatwave 2022, they've produced a really thorough, really honest, really interesting report about what happened in 2022. Basically, the heat caused cooling failures in some of the servers, resulting in IT outage. They had to shift to paper operations. They had over 100 treatment delays. They had staff morale being impacted, and they talk about that in the study, in the report that they produced. Their emergency systems were restored in 5 days, and full recovery from that incident took weeks, you know, and it cost them 1.4 million. So you can see here clearly that even just something like the failures of an IT system can really have a massive impact. And these things are only likely to become more common as temperatures get unsuitable. That's it from me for now.
Thanks, Morgan. Great introduction. Hopefully that set the scene for everyone. Couple of questions in the chat I've just been responding to. It's sadly 6.3 million is the figure for the properties, by the way, for flooding.
I thought it might be 6. I didn't want to overshoot it.
No, I appreciate that, and I think you did the right thing. But I've just checked, and yes, sadly, and it could be. They're saying increase to 8 by 2050. So there we go. That's just, and it is actually quite difficult to keep this kind of topic light and positive when we're talking about it. But equally, we don't want to sort of dampen the seriousness of it. So it's kind of getting that balance, really. With that in mind, what would be really keen just to spend a few minutes on now, with a show of virtual hands in the room, is just to get a few of your thoughts on what's on the slide now, basically. So extreme weather events that have happened in, say, the last few years. Think of the extreme heat of 2022, the storms Morgan mentioned of recent times, any flooding that's occurred. Obviously, I know Somerset, see that's a big risk and a big issue as well. Would just be really keen to get your thoughts on how it affected you, your job, the impacts that you saw, and any response that either you were involved in or that you know happened as a result of that. Just to get a little bit of scene setting, if you like, on how things have already been developing and how you've already had to experience some of this. So we've only got a few minutes on this, but so if we don't get to you, then feel free to share your experiences in the chat as well. But I'll start with Ben.
Thank you. Actually, just wanted to give a quick bit of positioning, if possible. So I'm working with Christine at the moment. I work in NHS England, heading up the greener digital work, and we're looking at how to kind of set requirements across the system for guiding towards low carbon and climate change resilient digital health systems. So I'm doing a load of thinking at the moment around this problem, around how do you get climate change resilient digital health, and I'm mainly here to listen today, and thanks very much for the invite. But just wanted to kind of try and give a little bit of a steer at this stage to say that, you know, the kind of key intervention points that we're really interested in is two kind of key questions, which is what is it that we can practically do to reduce the risk of the digital breaking due to climate risk, and the second one is, if it does break, what are the kind of recovery factors that are particular to the digital bit of health delivery that will help us get up and running as quickly as possible, that might fit into like broader EPRR and business continuity agendas. So I just wanted to kind of feed that in at this stage to try and kind of keep that bit of focus on the digital if possible. But I realise this exercise might be a bit broader than that.
Sure,
Yeah.
I'll take a note of that for then the next activity. We can re-prompt what you've just said, but sorry, I'll carry on.
No, I was just going to say that, and I think we will be touching on that later as well, particularly that first point you made there, Ben. And when there is we're not exclusively focusing on digital today, but there is a focus on digital today. So it's kind of a bit of both, really, I suppose. So because obviously we're just conscious of the audience, etc. But But yeah, no, thanks for that. That's really useful context, and thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Great. I'll move to Jeff.
Morning all. Hello again, Alan.
Hi,
I met
Jeff.
you in Coventry the other month. Yeah, so I'm working on this work stream with Christine as part of the wider programme of work with the Digital Greener team. So I'm an improvement consultant with ML CSU, but it's just I had an example at first with regards to flooding, but that was more kind of personal life and growing up and whatever else. But then actually, in terms of the ability to do your job, so when we had the extreme weather a few years ago, in terms of the heat, so I work from home as a lot of staff now do, and I hadn't thought about this before. So we've got a little office at the bottom of the garden, and the sun shines on it all day, and it's quite nice. But in the extreme heat, it was that bad. I had to come up and work from the house. But it's just made me realise, so I produce our quarterly reports for ML, for net zero and sustainability, and we're always promoting, obviously, the reduction of the footprint of the estate and all the savings that we're making. And there's a big focus on, obviously, the agile working. But I feel one of the big problems we're going to have is the amount of staff now that are working from home that aren't in air-conditioned offices. They're in their own workspace. In terms of digital, obviously we've got thousands of staff members who really now are more subject than ever to these extreme heat waves, because there won't be the physical space to go into an air-conditioned office because those footprints have reduced. So I don't actually know now what I would do if everyone was trying to get into the office and the heat was unbearable to be at home. I'm not sure what the answer would be there.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because you're absolutely right. It's really difficult, isn't it, with accountability and knowing exactly how everyone's home performs in extreme heat. And yeah, a lot of the time, the office or wherever the workplace is probably a better place to work during extreme heat than their home is, particularly if they're in a flat, or which are obviously often even worse than houses are. So yeah, it's a really big issue, and I think there's a bit of ambiguity and a bit of uncertainty about exactly how that issue is being done. Because I work at home permanently, and my office is 250 miles away. So what would I do in that scenario? I mean, I'm in Scotland, so we don't get heat, but you get the point. That the theory is there, that it could happen, and I'm sure there's lots and millions of people probably in this situation now. So it's a really good one to raise. Thanks for that, Andrew.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I've had the pleasure of working and leading emergency planning within the Trust for about 15 years. And I think tornadoes are about the only extreme weather event that we haven't had to deal with. We've had everything from volcanic eruptions, flooding, snow, beasts from the east, high winds, heat events, and it goes on and on and on. The particular challenge for us, as Richard on the call will know, is that we've got a massive estate, over 120 properties probably, spread over the whole of Somerset, which is a big rural county essentially. But we also have thousands of people driving between sites out in the community doing their job. And so, and the estate itself varies from 19th century all the way up to places that haven't actually been finished building yet, because we're still building them. So within the EPRR context, which I know and love, weather is one of those major disruptive events that we constantly have to plan for. And I've certainly seen over the last 15 years that the weather is getting hotter and wetter and windier, and occasionally a lot colder. It's a real challenge. If I had a blank checkbook, I could adapt all of our buildings accordingly. But at the end of the day, if I've got a hospital and I've got two that are on floodplains, it's extremely difficult to do anything about that, if I'm perfectly honest, let alone keeping people in their cars, being able to drive around, etc. I did do a piece of work years ago, and I think we worked out our business travel is something like 30 times around the world every year or something. It's probably gone up since then because we've got more staff. So it is extremely difficult. But on a personal note, I've managed to buy property with land, and I've planted 70 odd trees and dug 2 big ponds, which is a little contribution towards global warming, I hope.
Your own adaptation, Andrew. That's brilliant. Yeah, we like that. That's great. But no, I mean, you've just summed up perfectly, I think, the issues we're talking about today and the impact that it can have. And your experience of 15 years is really helpful, I think, for this context, because it just shows how the variety of things that can happen and the variety of impacts that can happen as well, which is, yeah, very, very wide ranging, very significant. And you've just raised the elephant in the room, which is the financing side, the funding side. We know that that's a massive problem, not just in the NHS for this agenda, but across the board. So yeah, that's really useful to hear that context. In the interest of time, I'll just take one more, and I think we've got Gareth next on there.
Good morning. Yeah, so just I've been working for 12 years in the NHS, working at Froome, who are a single site, single practice PCN in Somerset. Very large building. The building was built about 12 years ago. To a modern standard, but we're still in situations where extreme weather events are becoming more and more frequent and impacting us from the biggest threat to us is currently our power supply. You've seen it in extreme weather events. You'll get power outages that last for, perhaps an hour, maybe two. And that affects then the network, and we're not able to then continue the services that we provide in that situation. It's the most likely thing to occur to us in the event of these extreme weather events, but it's the most impactful for us. We could probably continue in the event of a flood. A fire might be isolated in a certain part of the building, but without power, it's crippling.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And Morgan highlighted in her introduction about what we call sort of cascading risks, and where you've got, it might be that actually you've got your own risks and it's sorted out, and you've got plans to deal with it, but actually, if the power goes off and National Grid haven't sorted something out, then that's going to impact on you. And it's kind of those links and those kind of connections between the various different things.
Yeah, we seem particularly vulnerable to it here. We've seen it happening quite a bit. When we spoke to the grid about the power supply to the building, and there's an equity consideration that we hadn't realised, that basically whether you're a hospital or a one-bedroom flat, you've still got the same level of rights to your power supply. So, in the event of, I think there was cost of living as well, was also affecting us. You get a power outage, and the argument is, shouldn't there be more measures to ensure that these sites are being protected? And apparently not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, thanks for that. And obviously, Christine at the end will talk about what the follow-up to this event is, and as part of that will likely be the development of an adaptation plan, and we can make sure things like that are really part of that to ensure that there's we can start thinking about ways and means of addressing those really challenging issues that you've raised. So no, that's really helpful. Thanks for that. And just from the three of you there that have spoken, I think that kind of demonstrates the variety and not just the variety of impacts, but how often it affects, what you guys do and the role of the NHS as well. So that's a really useful starting point. Thanks everyone. Okay, we're going to move on to the next presentation, back to Morgan, where we're actually sort of moving on from that. Actually, it's a really good segue into this bit, which is around actually addressing some of the impacts, the sort of things we've just been talking about, and an introduction to risk and adaptation. Morgan, over to you.
Thanks. Yes, yeah. Recap very quickly, because obviously it hasn't been that long since I talked about this, but just, that we're saying that some impacts are going to happen regardless of our net zero efforts. Climate change is happening now, but I think you guys have demonstrated that better than I did by just talking about kind of what you've experienced already. And just that reminder about vulnerabilities and deprivation, and the fact that these are the things that you guys address in general, with healthcare, and that's climate change is going to impact that as well. So I thought I'd start with how we look at risk, and hopefully this is familiar to lots of you that think about risk more generally anyway, but just to kind of help set the picture for what we're talking about with adaptation. Risk is a combination of not just the hazard, so not just the flood that happens, or not just the high temperatures. It's also the other factors like your exposure to that hazard and your vulnerability to that hazard. So your exposure being, you know, specifically where you are, whether you have barriers, whether you have, so if you're if there's high temperatures, for example, if you've got access to shade, you know, Alan said about, you know, living in a flat compared to living in a, you know, better ventilated home, for example, all these different things that affect your exposure to a risk. And then also your vulnerability is about how affected you would be by an impact. So, you know, your ability to bounce back, shall we say, after something, your resilience, essentially, in some ways, you know, yeah, how vulnerable are you to these impacts? You know, have you got pre-existing health conditions, for example? So we're going to be talking a lot about digital today throughout. So I thought I'd talk about the vulnerability of systems as well. That'll be things like single points of failure. You know, if you have an IT server go down, you know, is that the only way that you access your patient data, for example? That would be a single point of failure, which would make your system more vulnerable. And then also cascading impacts, of course, make you vulnerable as well. So things like what we've just talked about around power, you know, are you more vulnerable to power outages than other places, like was just mentioned in Froome? So those are kind of vulnerabilities when we talk about systems. Of course, there will also be vulnerabilities with respect to people as well. So generally people's demographics, their age, their health, their socioeconomic background, all of these things can impact a person's vulnerability as well. Particularly important, of course, for the healthcare service, because a very large proportion of the people that you treat will, by definition, be more vulnerable. Here's some examples that I thought I'd go through of kind of therefore what this means for your sorts of risks. In the NHS, you know, you could have high temperatures, would be the hazard. The exposure would be the fact that your IT servers are in a room that's south-facing, so gets the most sun possible, a building with little ventilation. That could be the sort of exposures that would therefore mean that high temperature affected you more. And then, like I mentioned, you know, your vulnerability could be relying on those IT servers for information on patients coming in and being treated in the hospital. You know, that would be the vulnerability there. Something a bit broader that I wanted to talk about as well, to show how this doesn't only mean just local risks and local hazards. There might be climate change impacts nationally or internationally, which could impact your supply chain. So let's say your IT support contractors, let's say they've got exposure to climate change in another area of the country to you. Their offices might be on a floodplain or somewhere that's likely to get higher temperature, or their financial stability as an organisation might be impacted. So those would be your exposures in that sense. And then your vulnerability might be having only one contractor for maintaining or repairing your cloud-based IT system. So if suddenly that organisation folded, or even just were inhibited to do anything for a couple of days during a storm, and you were also impacted by that storm, then that would be a vulnerability. So I just wanted to bring this one in to really show that we need to limit the scope somewhere when addressing these issues. You know, we can't fix everything, but it's just really important to recognise that there will be some risks kind of much broader than just the risks locally to your site that might impact your resilience. So the reason to kind of bring all of that in, the exposure and vulnerability stuff, is to basically then show you the definition of adaptation that we use, which is around any action to reduce vulnerability or exposure to those actual or expected impacts of climate change. You can't change the hazard necessarily. You know, you can't stop it raining, or you can't stop the temperature from rising, but what you can do is change your exposure or your vulnerability. So that's why we like to think about risk in those different ways, and like to think about scenarios in those ways, which we'll break them up into that in a moment. But yeah, our definition of adaptation is that, in short, we need to alter our behaviour, our systems and our ways of life to prepare our assets, our buildings, our businesses, our people, our environment and our society from the worst projected impacts of climate change. So that's what we're really talking about. I'll talk a bit about kind of what actions we need to take to hopefully explain some of those, you know, behaviour, systems and ways of life are all things we need to alter. And note also, we don't use the word protect because there's only so much protection that we can do from the impacts of climate change. in some scenarios. Like somebody mentioned earlier, if your building's built on a floodplain, there's only so much level of protection that you can provide there. So we need to prepare for these things. The sort of actions we can take, we like to split them up into these 4 different categories, really 3 categories, and then kind of this quick wins. So adaptation might look like hard interventions. That bottom right image, that's some flood barriers in Oxford, for example. And then the bottom 3 diagrams are from a really good resource produced by Arup, which is for schools, but actually is also just really useful information in general. And that's, hard examples of, the hard flood resilience measures. They've got actual flood barrier that comes up during flooding to prevent surface water flooding. You've got ventilation and cooling measures, things like that. Then you've got nature-based solutions. So that's more things like natural flood management, improving the condition of the nature around, or the fields around, the farming conditions, things like that, to make sure that water is held for longer and better to prevent flooding excessively. You could have tree cover for cooling and shading, having green spaces and blue spaces as well. So rivers, and streams and things and ponds can help hold water, but also help reduce the temperature overall in an area. We know that particularly urban areas with lots of concrete get hotter than areas with lots of green space. So those are kind of nature-based solutions we like to think about. And then also planning and strategy. So adaptation is not only about, planting trees or putting up flood barriers. It's also things like your strategic, your existing policy and procedure. Does your procurement policy take into consideration those vulnerabilities, those single points of failure that I mentioned already? Are you engaging with the electricity companies to think about how you can have your electricity system be more resilient? Have you got a climate change risk assessment? Do you understand what your risks are, what the biggest priorities are for your community or for your sites? And do you have an adaptation plan? And are your staff on board? Do you have board level approval of kind of adaptation in general? Have you got resourcing? Planning and strategy is an extremely important part of this. Without it, you really can't enable any of those other types of interventions. That final section, quick wins, essentially any no regret simple measures, or integrating into existing projects for things like decarbonisation. So if you've got a tree planting project already funded, how can we make sure that those trees are planted in a place that helps with adaptation as well? So quick wins can kind of be across all 3 of those there. Just something to consider. That's it from me for now.
Thanks, Morgan. And again, it's actually some really good conversations going on in the chat as well, which I know you won't be able to see at the moment, which we'll try and save all of that and feed that in as well. So thanks to keep that conversation going, folks. It's really good. Right, so now we're going to do, well, you see, the thing is we've got pressure on our side here, because we've got digital experts on the call, and we're now going to use breakout groups. So that's what could possibly go wrong. Please don't judge us on our ability to get this right. We are going to split you into 2 groups, and this is what we're going to be focusing on. We have got you some scenarios, and for each of those scenarios, we'd like you to think about what would the impact be if this happened on your role or organisation? What factors affect vulnerability and also exposure to those scenarios as well? It'll all become clear when we split into the breakout rooms. Okay, thanks, Morgan. Right on cue. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for returning to us. So hopefully part 1, we've talked about obviously introduced adaptation, risk, impact, etc. Some really great discussions on the scenarios in the breakout group I was involved in earlier as well. So thanks for sharing all of that experience and also your thoughts on what could happen in those scenarios. What we're going to talk about now are drivers for adaptation, and there's a few parts to this which Morgan will explain through, and then we will do another short workshop towards the end, just to kind of bring all of that together. So, Morgan, I'll hand straight over to you.
Sure, thank you. So, basically, the first thing to talk about is the fact that as we get into this, really talking about what adaptation, how it's deliverable and how we can actually get these things to happen, that we've just been, addressing the kind of scenarios we've just been talking about. just want to recognise a few things first. You know, adaptation can be really effective at a local level. You know, the system that the integrated care system provides is a really useful one, could be a useful tool for adapting. You know, you understand local issues and then are able to support trusts who understand even more local issues, and organisations like that. But we recognise that organisations at that level do have quite little power, resource and guidance to help with adaptation at the moment, if any. So it's critical to prioritise adaptation that provides multiple different benefits and makes use of existing resources by linking with local priorities. So I want to give you some drivers now to help with how one might build a business case for adaptation, or at least to start thinking about that. You know, how can we maximise the minimal resource and support that we have to do what we're doing without getting too political. That's what I'll say. So first, policy and strategy. Like I say, there's not a whole lot, but there is some that can help you drive this work. So the Climate Change Act in 2008 commits the government to net zero, but also to climate adaptation. There is wording in there about adapting to climate change. The Health and Care Act in 2022 then dictates the NHS, the healthcare system in the UK, supporting that work. So there is at least a sentence somewhere that says there is an obligation to adapt to climate change. Without going into too much detail around the structures of it, there is a DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, are currently the department responsible for adaptation in the UK. There is a few different things that they do with respect to that, one of which is also this separate adaptation reporting power, which different organisations report to say where they are with adaptation, what the risks are from climate change. This is not at the moment a mandatory requirement. So only some organisations do it. Things like National Grid do it, National Highways, organisations like that. And the UK HSA do it on behalf of the healthcare system. So the UK HSA Health and Care Adaptation Report, the fourth of which is coming out imminently, right? There was consultation on that just before Christmas. That's why that exists. That's kind of part of this wide adaptation reporting power in the UK. So there is some level of kind of expectation there to for the Health Security Agency to report on what the risks might be from climate change and therefore what might be done about it. These haven't had much specific guidance so far, particularly for like this kind of level of ICS or NHS trust or organisational level in that sense, but it does exist. The Adverse Weather and Health Plan is another thing that exists. Obviously, that lays out who's responsible for addressing which areas of adaptation in the UK related to health. So it's a helpful tool for looking at responsibility. For example, it talks about local authorities often being the local lead flood authority, so they're responsible for addressing flood risk in their region, and it talks about ICSs in the sense of the consideration of reasonable worst case scenario and extreme events for adverse weather being part of community risk registers, and also the 9 areas of service included that the ICB is responsible for. Service delivery of need to include consideration of adverse weather with respect to climate change as well. There are some have already been the case. I forget which, maybe it's about EPRR, but basically there's a few different, sorry, I'll skip ahead a couple. So the core standards for the emergency planning, of course, in a couple of years ago, then now has to include adverse weather arrangements, which are reflective of climate change risk. The ERIC reports, the ERIC reporting system, you know, sites must document flooding incidences and heat wave, you know, and when wards get over 26 degrees, although I understand that there's the variation of, you know, quality of these sorts of things is yeah, varies. So I'm aware that there's these are not perfect systems, but there are basically, the point of these couple slides is just to show you that there are systems in place to help you justify adaptation and to argue that this is actually already part of your job, even if it's not super clear and there's not a lot of support and guidance for it. Obviously, from a digital side, you know, Ben here today, there is a lot more work now being done on the digital side, from kind of a greener NHS level. But yeah, still work to be done. The 10-year infrastructure strategy I thought would be another good example with respect to the integrated care system as well, that your priorities and national drivers for that kind of long-term estates work also needs to include sustainability. So I won't spend too long on those because I think, you know, I'm probably talking to people who know far more about those sorts of policies and strategies than I do, but hopefully that just gives you a taste for having a little bit of a further dive into some of those and realising that adaptation and climate change recognition is an important part of those already. The more important side is around co-benefits, I think, for the sake of me talking to you guys today. So understanding that there are lots of scenarios where adaptation can help elevate other existing priorities that we have. It doesn't have to be an extra thing on top of everything else we do completely separately. You know, it should integrate with our existing priorities. I spent a little while at the start of this workshop talking about the difference between mitigation and adaptation. They are different, but that does not mean that there aren't actions that will benefit both. You know, things like having better energy security and efficiency can help with adaptation, but also obviously reduce emissions. Things like working out improving digital systems, of course, can support net zero as well. I've included here a few different examples of co-benefits, some of which relate more to digital than others, but are certainly all relevant to the NHS. You know, you have things like business resilience. I think that's probably the biggest thing we talked about, you know, in the groups with scenario wise. You know, if you're doing adaptation to increase your energy security or to increase your supply chain stability or improve your staff wellbeing and productivity, of course, these are all things that have benefits for your organization's, you know, resilience in general and success in general. Efficiencies as well, like I've just mentioned, we would hope that by implementing measures which support people's health, that we can actually reduce wait times and overcrowding and things like that as well. Adaptation is a good opportunity to invest in things longer term so that maintenance, the amount of maintenance required is reduced, things like that. Service quality is kind of related to that too. You know, greater infection prevention and control can be a really big part of adaptation, recognising the increased likelihood of new pests and diseases and things like that. Also, I think a really nice one is stronger relationships. So stronger relationships with staff and patients and suppliers and communities is a really big part of, you know, adaptation should be done in collaboration with lots of different organisations and groups and individuals. So that can be done to also just generally increase your relationship with communities. That can also be really helpful. And then, of course, the environmental side as well, you know, nature-based solutions in particular, reducing air and water pollution, increasing resource efficiency, improving biodiversity. You know, planting a tree can have many, many benefits, not just for adaptation or not just for net zero. Ben?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wonder what other kind of buzzword co-benefits topics people could think about. Like you mentioned in your intro around equality and like the poorer communities being affected more by climate change. So there's a health inequality angle here, I think. And also, I think one of the key documents that we could put on the list is the health effects of climate change document from the UKHSA, which speaks to a topic that came up in our group around increased burden on the system from increased population health issues from climate change. And that's how can we kind of manage that and limit like any worsening in clinical outcomes, which is obviously probably the biggest priority for our system. So yeah, just wondering if we can broaden this a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, let me take you on to kind of this area of kind of how we might embed adaptation, because our activity is going to be based around that now. And so let's maybe focus that actually on kind of the buzzwords of these co-benefits. You know, actually, what can we integrate into that are already our priorities. Yeah, I won't spend too long on this and I'll just let you guys kind of talk about it. So we want adaptation to be part of business as usual. It doesn't have to be something which is, you know, a completely new separate topic, like I said. So having adaptation actions doesn't just mean, you building flood barriers, like I say, things that are only adaptation. So examples might be training. You might have existing training that should or could include helping support people understanding their risk from climate change, or understanding how to deal with extreme weather or rising temperatures, whether that be for like clinical staff or digital staff, or kind of board level buy-in. You might have existing workshops or conferences or events that you do. You might have sustainability related events or conferences, or estates related conferences and events that should really be including, you might think, oh, today, yeah, those should really be talking about, the climate change risks and things. We should be having those conversations in that broader sense, as well as within your existing governance. It's not just about hiring an adaptation lead and leaving it there. Like, if we got boards and committees like health and equality boards, or communications kind of campaigns and working groups and things that could include adaptation within them as well. Your procurement, I've mentioned this already, but is there a way that procurement can be more resilient, can integrate considerations for climate in that? Existing or future projects, that might be building projects, it might be campaigns with communities, addressing current biggest health issues, things like diabetes, for example. Maybe we can, are there ways to integrate into our existing communications about adaptation and about preparing for extreme weather? And then just more generally, your guidelines and procedures and policies. Ben mentioned this earlier, we need clearer guidance. Can we have more specific mention of what to do in different scenarios, and what sort of level of climate change we need to prepare for in our estates policies or strategies, for example, in our 10-year infrastructure strategy.
As if by magic, the slides appear. Look at that. Fantastic. So thanks, everyone. Another really great session. Just a couple of points to conclude, really. I'll just hand over shortly to Christine to talk a bit about next steps. But hopefully today you've got just simply a greater understanding of climate change adaptation, and the impact of the climate risks can have on health and healthcare and the NHS and your role, etc. So hopefully we've done some way towards achieving that, and also in terms of where climate change risk and adaptation could be embedded into your work, which is exactly what we were just talking about. So thinking about what strategies and plans, what activities have you got coming up within your roles where this should be considered in some way, shape or form, and hopefully we've set the wheels in motion there for you to think about that as a little bit as well. So hopefully you feel that we've partly achieved these objectives today. Just to hand over quickly to Christine, if you'd just like to talk a little bit about what happens next.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks for your engagement today. Thanks again for your time. It's been a really great session, and so great to hear from your roles, really, from the risks and the impacts, and your expertise that you've brought to the session today. So thank you. I hope that you've been able to get a sense from today, reintroduction or introduction to adaptation, about how your roles might be able to help shape the digital chapter around climate resilience and adaptation. I hope that's got some, got some good points to think about. I hope to come out of that. I made some notes as we were going along, and the single point of failure, that was something, I think it came up in the chat, but something that might be helpful to take away, to think about, within your roles. Is there a single point of failure, in terms of digital, and to think about how we can keep digital resilient. And Ben made a comment about how we can keep digital resilient so that we can keep the NHS resilient, and that's that's our sort of objective really in all of our roles. So yeah, just some things to think about there. In terms of next steps, thank you for those that have agreed to meet with Transform UK. Claire Robinson, who is leading that work, will be in touch with you directly. It might be either one-to-one sort of interview kind of scenario, or workshop scenario if there are a few sort of people with the same discipline kind of thing. I think that's what she's thinking. She's developing what those questions will look like, but it will really just be building on the kind of conversations we've been having today and thinking about digital resilience. But your input into those conversations is really valuable. So again, if you can engage as open and honestly as you can, and maybe think about some digital resilience before those conversations. But Claire will be in touch. I think they're scheduled for late Jan, early Feb. But I will also be in touch with all of you, maybe to have perhaps some group sessions or one-to-one sessions, so we can kind of have a bit of a debrief really from today, from today's session, and thinking a bit more about that digital chapter for our climate adaptation resilience plan, and more broadly, if there's any sort of other risks that you think, oh, okay, that that wasn't talked about, but I think we should make a note of it, that kind of thing. I welcome all of your expertise. And I suppose just to finish off, it is thinking about those co-benefits. So thinking about how we can integrate into what's already happening. Sustainability is such a, that's exactly how we try and, deliver the green plan, trying to embed it in what's already happening. There isn't a lot of investment for sustainability. So it is about trying to maximise those opportunities of things that are already in place, but the co-benefits are really important. I think that will really help us develop our climate adaptation plan as well, and thinking about how things feed into each other. So yeah, it'll be great to chat to you guys separately about that, but thanks again for your time and engagement today.
Lovely. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, thanks everyone, and really appreciate your time, and we'll let you go 5 minutes early, I think. Thanks all. Thanks for your participation.